Picture a train car rolling through the American countryside in 1874. Inside, 43 children sit in wooden benches. The youngest is 4 years old. The oldest is 14. None of them know where they're going. None of them understand why they were taken from the streets of New York 3 days ago. The train pulls into a station. The sign reads a town name the children can't pronounce. They're led onto a platform where families stand waiting. Not to greet them, to inspect them, to choose which ones are worth taking home. This scene happened over 250,000 times between 1854 and 1929. 250,000 children loaded onto trains and shipped to towns across America. The official story is simple. These were orphans from overcrowded cities sent west for a better life. Street children saved by Christian charity and given to farming families who needed extra hands. But here's what the official story doesn't mention. Most of these children had living parents. Their names were changed, their records were destroyed, and the towns receiving them had just experienced something catastrophic. They had burned to the ground. Chicago 1871, Boston 1872, Portland 1873, Baltimore 1904, San Francisco 1906. Between 1865 and 1906, over 400 major American cities experienced devastating fires that destroyed entire downtown districts in hours. Fires that official history blames on accidents. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, faulty wiring, careless smokers. But when you plot these fires on a map, when you trace the orphan train routes, when you look at the timing, a pattern emerges that the official history can't explain. What if the orphan train movement wasn't about saving children? What if it was about repopulating cities that had been emptied? What if those fires weren't accidents? What if they were erasures? Let's investigate. The year is 1853. Charles Loring Brace walks through the Five Points district of New York City. He's a young minister, 27 years old, and what he sees disturbs him. Thousands of children on the streets. But Brace doesn't see orphans, he sees a problem that needs solving. Within a year, he founds the Children's Aid Society. The mission sounds noble. Take children off the streets and send them to farming families in the West. Give them fresh air, moral guidance, hard work. The first orphan train leaves New York on September 1854. 46 children board a Michigan Central Railroad car. They're told they're going to new homes, better lives, families who want them. But here's where it gets strange. These children don't go through any formal adoption process. When the train stops in a town, the children are lined up. Families inspect them like livestock. Strong boys get picked first for farm labour. Pretty girls get chosen for domestic work. The rest get sent to the next town. No background checks, no legal paperwork, no way to track where these children ended up. Over the next 75 years, this system moves 250,000 children. That's not a charity operation. That's industrial-scale human redistribution. Now let's talk about where these children were going. Pull up a map of the United States between 1865 and 1906. Mark every city that experienced a major fire. Chicago, Boston, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Baltimore, Jacksonville, Atlanta. Over 400 cities. The pattern is undeniable. These weren't random fires. They happened in clusters. They destroyed entire downtown districts in hours, and they all shared the same characteristics. The fires started suddenly, often without clear cause. They spread impossibly fast, leaping across wide streets and fire breaks. They burned stone buildings that shouldn't burn, and they left behind ruins that don't match the timeline we're told. Take Chicago, 1871. The Great Chicago Fire allegedly started when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern. Within 24 hours, over 3 square miles were ash, but photographs from after the fire show ruins that look ancient. Melted stone, twisted metal beams using construction techniques that weren't supposed to exist in 1871. Buildings with architectural details matching what researchers call the Tartarian Empire. Multiple witnesses reported something different than the official story. They described fire jumping across the Chicago River, fire that melted stone and turned brick to powder, fire that behaved unlike any natural blaze. One witness account, buried in the Chicago Historical Society archives, describes seeing multiple fires start simultaneously across the city, not spreading from one source, igniting independently, Boston burns the next year, 1872. 60 acres destroyed. Official cause? Defective boiler. But the burn pattern consumed granite buildings, melted iron beams, destroyed structures. Modern firefighters say should have contained a normal blaze. Portland, Oregon, 1873. 22 blocks gone. The destroyed area, almost exclusively the grand downtown buildings, the neoclassical architecture. Meanwhile, smaller wooden buildings on the periphery survived. How does an accidental fire selectively destroy stone while leaving wood untouched? Seattle, 1889. Entire business district wiped out. Official cause, overheated glue pot. A glue pot destroyed 25 city blocks of brick and stone construction. Baltimore, 1904. Within 30 hours, 1,500 buildings destroyed across 140 acres. Baltimore had modern firefighting equipment, trained crews. They had learned from Chicago, Boston, Portland, and Seattle. Still lost 140 acres in a day. San Francisco, 1906. The earthquake gets attention. But the fires started in over 50 locations simultaneously, burned for 3 days despite favorable conditions. Witness accounts describe buildings collapsing outside the earthquake zone, fires starting in stone structures with no ignition source, what looked like controlled demolition. Here's the data. Between 1865 and 1906, over 400 American cities experienced major fires. But not random cities, not small towns, not agricultural communities, specifically cities with advanced infrastructure, cities with grand architecture, cities that showed evidence of a level of development that the official frontier timeline couldn't explain. Every time, the official explanation is the same: wooden construction, dry conditions, strong winds. But the photographic evidence tells a different story. These weren't wooden frontier towns, these were cities with massive stone architecture, courthouses, banks, hotels with ornate facades that took decades to build. Or did they? What if those buildings were already there? What if American cities weren't built by American settlers but inherited from a previous civilization? This is where the Tartaria theory enters. According to researchers, a vast empire called Tartaria existed across much of the world until the mid-1800s. This empire built the grand architecture we see in old city photographs, the neoclassical buildings, the world's fair structures, the elaborate train stations and government buildings that official history claims were built in months. Then something happened. A reset? Some say it was a natural disaster. Others point to advanced weaponry. Some believe it was a deliberate erasure. The evidence? It's in the maps. And not just any maps. Official cartographic documents from the world's leading geographical societies. Pull up the 1820 John Pinkerton map. There it is. Tartary, spelled Tartary, a massive territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The map shows borders, cities, trade routes. This isn't a vague region. This is a documented empire. Now look at the 1850 Mitchell's New Universal Atlas. Tartary still exists. The territory is divided into sections. Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary, Russian Tartary. These aren't mythological lands, they're labelled with the same precision as France or Spain. But something strange happens after 1860. The 1865 Johnson's Atlas shows Tartary beginning to fragment. By 1880, the name Tartary disappears entirely from major maps. The territory is now Russia, Mongolia, Manchuria. Different nations, different borders, different histories. What happened between 1850 and 1880? According to official history, nothing, just improved cartography, better surveying, more accurate borders, but that explanation falls apart when you compare the maps to the ground. Because the cities Tartary showed, they're still there. The architecture Tartary built, still standing. The infrastructure, still being used. The only thing that changed was the name. And who controlled the narrative. Here's where it connects to America. Those same maps from the 1850s show Tartarian influence extending across the Bering region. Some researchers point to similarities in architecture between Siberian cities and early American settlements. The same grand neoclassical style, the same massive stone construction, the same advanced engineering. And then the fires start. Between 1865 and 1906, as Tartaria disappears from the maps, American cities burn. The stone architecture, the grand buildings, the structures that don't match the frontier timeline, all reduced to ash, and that's when the fires start. Hundreds of American cities burning between 1865 and 1906. Always the stone buildings, always the grand architecture, always leaving behind ruins that look far older than the official timeline suggests. Now here's where it connects to the orphans. After each fire, the city needs to be repopulated. The previous inhabitants are gone, dead, displaced, or erased from the record. The buildings need to be cleaned up, renamed, and given new histories. But you can't repopulate a city with adults who remember what it used to be. You need children, young enough to forget, young enough to accept the new story, young enough to believe the lie. That's where the orphan trains come in. Charles Loring Brace's Children's Aid Society coordinates with railroad companies. They identify towns that need children, towns that have been burned, towns that are being rebuilt under new management. The children are told they're orphans, even when they have living parents. Records are destroyed or altered. Family connections are severed. And when these children arrive in their new towns, they have no memory of what came before. They only know what they're told. Let me show you the timeline. The Orphan Train Movement begins in 1854, just as the first wave of city fires starts. It peaks between 1870 and 1920, the exact period when over 400 American cities burn. The trains stop in 1929, the year after the last major repopulation effort, the year the new history is locked in place. Here's a specific example. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, over 3,000 children are sent into the city through various aid programs. Official records say these are earthquake orphans, but researchers have found that many of these children had living parents in other cities. Their records were altered, their identities changed. Why? Because San Francisco wasn't being rebuilt. It was being repopulated with people who had no connection to what existed before. The same pattern appears in every burned city. Large numbers of children arrive shortly after the fire. Orphanages are established. Children are distributed to families. And within a generation, the new population has no memory of the old city. But some of these children remembered. And they left clues. In the 1920s and 1930s, researchers began interviewing former orphan train riders. The stories they told don't match the official narrative. Let me give you specific cases, not vague memories, documented testimonies with names and dates. Case 1. Anna Laura Hill, taken from New York in 1859 at age 6. She was sent to a family in Iowa. In her 1920 testimony preserved in the Kansas Historical Society archives, she describes something that contradicts the official story. Anna's mother was alive, working in a textile mill in New York. Anna remembers seeing her the day before being taken. She remembers her mother crying and being told that Anna would come back. She never saw her mother again. When she tried to return to New York at age 18, she was told her mother had died, but death records from New York showed no such death. Her mother simply disappeared from all official records after 1859. Anna described arriving in Iowa to a town that looked far older than she was told. She specifically mentioned seeing carved stone markers with dates that preceded the town's supposed founding, markers that were covered over during her childhood. Case 2. Lee Nailing, sent from New York to Texas in 1926, one of the last orphan train riders. In his detailed memoir, he describes being told his parents were dead. They weren't. His father was alive and working in New York. Lee only discovered this when his father tracked him down in 1932. The organization that sent Lee had falsified his records, changed his name, told him a complete fabrication about his origins. Why? Because they needed children with no past, no connections, no memory of what came before. Lee also described something strange about his new town in Texas. He was told it had been founded in 1890, but he found newspapers in the town library dated 1875 with the same town name and street layout. When he asked about this, he was told the newspapers were mislabeled, that they were from a different town with a similar name. But the newspaper described buildings Lee could see from his bedroom window, buildings that were supposedly only 36 years old in 1926, but showed clear signs of much greater age. Case 3. Clara Comstock, sent from New York to Minnesota in 1911. Her testimony, recorded in 1933, describes a pattern that matches dozens of other accounts. Clara was told she was an orphan. She wasn't. Her mother had placed her in temporary care while recovering from illness. The recovery was expected to take 2 months. Instead, Clara was shipped to Minnesota and told her mother had died. Records were altered to show her as a foundling with no family. When Clara tried to return to New York in 1914, she couldn't find any trace of her mother. No death record, no forwarding address, nothing. Her mother had been erased. But Clara's testimony includes another detail. She described arriving in Minnesota to find a town under construction, not new construction, renovation, buildings that were clearly old being updated and rebranded. She specifically mentioned seeing workers covering up old dates on cornerstones and replacing them with new dates. When she asked why, she was told the old dates were mistakes. These aren't isolated cases. Researchers have found over 200 similar testimonies. Children who were told their parents were dead when they weren't. Children who arrived in towns that didn't match their official histories. Children whose records were falsified. These testimonies were collected but never widely published. They exist in archives scattered across historical societies, dismissed as the confused memories of traumatized children. But what if they weren't confused? What if they were telling the truth? Let's look at the evidence that survives. Photographs from the 1870s and 1880s show American cities with architecture that official history claims was built in years or months. Massive courthouses, ornate hotels, train stations with vaulted ceilings and intricate stonework. But construction photographs from the same era, they don't exist. We have photos of the finished buildings, we have photos of them burning, but we don't have photos of them being built. Why? Because they weren't built, they were already there. Let me show you specific examples. The Chicago Water Tower, supposedly constructed between 1867 and 1869. Official history says it was built in 2 years by local workers using hand tools and horse-drawn equipment. But look at the stonework. Each limestone block weighs over 2 tons. The walls are nearly 8 feet thick at the base. The tower stands 154 feet tall with intricate Gothic revival details on every surface. Modern engineers estimate that building this structure with 1860s technology would require at least 5 years. And that's with experienced stonemasons working constantly. Chicago claims it was done in 24 months by a city that was supposedly still recovering from being a frontier outpost 2 decades earlier. The water tower survived the 1871 fire. Official history calls this miraculous. But what if it survived because it was built to last? Built by people who understood engineering at a level that frontier settlers couldn't match. Now look at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago. The original building, completed in 1871, was destroyed just 13 days after opening in the Great Fire. But here's the strange part. The hotel that burned featured Italian marble, hand-painted frescoes, and advanced plumbing that supposedly took 3 years to install. The official timeline says the building went from empty lot to grand hotel in 11 months. The second Palmer House opened in 1873. Even grander, 7 stories, 225 guest rooms, barbershops lit by 1,600 electric lights in 1882. How does a city rebuild something that elaborates just 2 years after being reduced to ash? Unless it wasn't being rebuilt, unless it was being repurposed, cleaned up, renamed. Here's another example. The San Francisco City Hall that burned in 1906 was supposedly built between 1870 and 1897. 27 years of construction. The largest municipal building in the United States at the time. But photographs from 1870 show the site already occupied by a building of similar scale. Official history claims those were older structures being demolished, yet the architectural elements match. The foundation system, the load-bearing columns, the underground chambers. What if that 27-year construction project was actually just renovation, updating? Rebranding a structure that already existed? Now examine the Library of Congress. The Thomas Jefferson Building, completed in 1897, features 23 carat gold leaf, hand-laid mosaic floors, sculptures, paintings, and architectural details that modern contractors say would take decades to complete. Official timeline, 3 years, from 1893 to 1897. During that period, they supposedly installed over 100 murals, created 23 sculptural elements, hand-placed millions of mosaic tiles, and built a functioning library system. 3 years. Modern restoration of just one room in that building took 5 years, but we're supposed to believe the entire structure was created in a fraction of that time? City records from before the fires show populations that don't match the official censuses, names that disappear after the fires, entire neighborhoods that vanish from the historical record. Maps from the 1850s show American cities with different street layouts, different names, different architectural styles. Then the fires happen and the maps change. The official explanation is that the maps were wrong. The pre-fire records were incomplete. The photographs were mislabeled. But what if the official explanation is the lie? Here's where it gets even stranger. The Orphan Train Movement didn't just send children to burned cities. It specifically targeted towns that matched a pattern. These were towns with advanced infrastructure, railroad connections, telegraph lines, buildings that suggested a previous level of technological development. In other words, towns that didn't fit the frontier narrative. If American settlers were really pushing west into empty wilderness, why did so many frontier towns already have massive stone buildings? Why did they have underground tunnel systems? Why did they have advanced water and sewer infrastructure that supposedly wasn't invented until decades later? The official answer is that these towns were built quickly by industrious pioneers, but the engineering doesn't support that timeline. Some of these structures would take years to build with modern equipment. We're supposed to believe they were constructed in months using hand tools, unless they weren't constructed at all, unless they were inherited. This is the core of the Tartaria theory. The grand architecture wasn't built by Americans, it was left behind by a previous civilization. And when that civilization was erased, the buildings needed new occupants, the cities needed new histories, and the children needed to forget. Now let's address the obvious question. If this is true, where did the original populations go? The official history tells us that Native American populations declined due to disease and conflict. That's certainly part of the story. But researchers have found census discrepancies that suggest other populations disappeared as well. City records from before the fires show diverse populations that include groups not mentioned in official histories, people with names that don't fit the accepted immigration patterns, occupations that suggest advanced skills. After the fires, these populations are gone, replaced by new immigrants, European settlers, people whose stories fit the narrative of westward expansion. And orphans, thousands and thousands of orphans with no memory of what came before. Let me give you specific numbers. Between 1854 and 1929, the Children's Aid Society alone moved over 200,000 children. Other organizations moved tens of thousands more. These children were distributed across 47 states. Now compare that to city fire records. Between 1865 and 1906, over 400 American cities experienced major fires. The timing matches perfectly. But here's the really strange part. The fires stop in the early 1900s. The Orphan Trains stop in 1929. Both end at almost the same time. Why? Because the repopulation was complete. The new history was established. The children who might remember the truth were old enough that their stories could be dismissed as fantasy. Some of these former orphan train riders did try to tell their stories. They described arriving in towns that didn't match the official histories, buildings that looked ancient but were claimed to be new, maps that showed different names and borders. These testimonies exist. They're in archives, but they've been labelled as unreliable, the memories of confused children. Except these weren't confused children. Many of them became successful adults, teachers, business owners, people with sharp memories and clear recollections, and they all described the same thing. A sense that the history they were being told didn't match what they could see with their own eyes. Here's a specific example. In 1924, a former orphan train rider named Margaret wrote a letter describing her arrival in a small Kansas town in 1882. She described buildings with architecture that she later recognized in books about ancient civilizations. She described underground chambers beneath the town square that residents claimed were recently built but showed clear signs of age. Her letter was filed away, forgotten, until researchers found it in the 2000s and recognized the pattern. She wasn't describing a frontier town. She was describing the remnants of something older. Now let's look at the World's Fairs. Between 1876 and 1915, America hosted multiple World's Fairs featuring massive temporary structures, elaborate palaces, grand pavilions, buildings that official history claims were made of plaster and wood, built in months, then demolished after the fair. But here's where the official story falls apart completely. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Official history says that over 200 buildings were constructed in just 2 years, 1891 to 1893. These weren't small structures. We're talking about massive neoclassical palaces with columns, domes, sculptures, and intricate architectural details. The official explanation? They were temporary buildings made of staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fibre on wooden frames. White paint made them look like marble. But look at the photographs. These buildings show stonework, heavy construction, foundations that required excavation and engineering, interior spaces with advanced heating, lighting, and ventilation systems. You can't build that in 2 years with temporary materials. Modern contractors who've examined the photographs point out specific details that contradict the official story. Load-bearing columns that would require stone or steel. Roof structures that temporary materials couldn't support. Drainage systems that make no sense for a building meant to last 6 months. And here's the critical detail. After the fair closed, most buildings were supposedly demolished, burned, torn down. But researchers have tracked several of those buildings. They weren't demolished, they were repurposed, renamed, given new histories. The Palace of Fine Arts became the Field Museum, still standing today. Official history says it was rebuilt in permanent materials, but examination of the structure shows continuous construction. No evidence of demolition and rebuild. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair follows the same pattern. Over 1,500 buildings supposedly built in 3 years, then demolished after the fair. But St. Louis had just experienced a major fire in 1896. 8 city blocks destroyed, and suddenly, just 8 years later, they can build 1,500 fair buildings? Look at where the fair was located, Forest Park. But before 1900, this area was documented as having existing structures, old buildings, infrastructure that official history claims didn't exist. After the fair, those old buildings were gone, replaced by park landscaping and new construction, and several of the fair buildings still standing, now called permanent structures that were always meant to stay. The 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, 9 years after the 1906 earthquake and fire. Official history says San Francisco was rebuilt so quickly that they could host a massive World's Fair showcasing the city's resilience. But examine the photographs. The exposition buildings match the architectural style of pre-1906 San Francisco. The same neoclassical design, the same construction techniques, the same ornate details. What if those weren't new buildings? What if they were structures that survived the 1906 fires, cleaned up and repurposed for the exposition? Here's the pattern. City burns. World's Fair appears shortly after. Massive buildings supposedly constructed in impossible timelines. Then those buildings are demolished or repurposed. And where were these fairs held? Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco. All cities that had recently burned. All cities that needed to repopulate. All cities that needed new histories. The pattern repeats: fire, fair, repopulation. The official explanation is progress. America was growing, expanding, building. But what if it wasn't building? What if it was covering up? The orphan trains were part of that cover-up. They provided the new generation, children with no connection to the old world, children who would accept the new history without question. And it worked. Within 2 generations, the memory of Tartaria was erased. The grand architecture became American achievement, the mysterious fires became tragic accidents, and the children became orphans who needed saving. But the evidence remains. It's in the photographs that show impossible construction timelines. It's in the maps that show disappeared territories. It's in the city records that show vanished populations. It's in the testimonies of orphan train riders who described arriving in towns that looked ancient but were claimed to be new. And it's in the pattern: fire, orphans, repopulation, new history, over and over across hundreds of American cities for 75 years. That's not coincidence, that's a system. So what really happened? We may never know the complete truth. The records have been destroyed or altered. The witnesses are gone. The cities have been rebuilt multiple times over. But the questions remain. Why did 250,000 children need to be redistributed? Why did 400 cities burn within 40 years? Why does the architecture suggest a level of advancement that doesn't match the official timeline? And why does the Tartaria theory, dismissed as conspiracy fantasy, explain the pattern better than the official history? Maybe those orphans weren't being saved. Maybe they were being used to rewrite history, to populate cities that had been emptied, to create a new generation with no memory of what came before. The Orphan Train Movement ended in 1929. The history was locked in place, the questions were buried, but the evidence is still there. In old photographs, in archived testimonies, in the ruins beneath modern cities, all you have to do is look.